The air in the courthouse hallway was thick with tension, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Aisha Carter walked purposefully through the grand entrance, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She adjusted the lapel of her tailored navy blazer, smoothing out an almost invisible crease. Her natural curls framed her face, bold, unapologetic, and regal. She held her head high, her gaze steady. To anyone watching, she looked every bit the confident, composed professional she had fought her whole life to become. But not everyone saw her that way. Aisha barely had time to register the sharp, authoritative voice barking behind her. "Hey, you there." She turned, eyebrows raised, as 3 uniformed officers approached with hard, unyielding expressions. The tallest one, his badge gleaming and his jaw set like stone, pointed at her as if she were an intruder. "State your business," he demanded, his tone cold and dismissive. Aisha squared her shoulders. "I'm here for the court proceedings scheduled at 11. The officer's eyes narrowed. "And who do you think you are, walking in here like that?" Aisha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another officer stepped forward, roughly grabbing her arm. "This courthouse doesn't have room for troublemakers. You think you can just waltz in here looking like that and not get checked?" A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I assure you, I am not here to cause any trouble," the tallest officer scoffed. "That what they teach you in the hood? Come in, act important, and throw your weight around. Not on my watch." She clenched her jaw, but remained silent, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. Growing up in South Memphis had taught her to master her emotions. She had faced countless battles just to survive and get where she was today. She wasn't about to let their arrogance unravel her resolve. One of the officers circled her, looking her up and down with a sneer. "Look at that hair. Never seen anything like it. How much you got hiding in there, huh?" Aisha didn't respond, her stomach churning with a familiar mix of anger and fear. The officer standing behind her gave a nasty smirk, and before she could react, he yanked her arm harder and forced her to sit down on a metal chair positioned against the wall. "Let's make sure you're not hiding anything dangerous," the tall officer growled. "Get the clippers." Another officer, younger and eager to impress, rushed forward with a pair of electric clippers. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest as she processed what was about to happen. "Wait," she started, but her voice was drowned out by the loud mechanical buzz that suddenly filled the hallway. She felt rough hands grip her shoulder, pinning her in place as another officer grabbed her hair, twisting it cruelly. "You think you're something special," the tall officer mocked, leaning in close enough that she could feel his stale breath on her cheek. "You walk in here like you're somebody, but you ain't nothing. Not to me. Not to this system." The clippers bit into her hair, their merciless teeth chewing through her curls. Aisha gritted her teeth, fighting the wave of humiliation that threatened to drown her. Hair fell to the floor in thick, uneven clumps, scattering like ashes across the polished marble. She stared at the ground, focusing on a single crack between the tiles, willing herself not to cry. Laughter erupted around her as they continued, commenting on the way her scalp became visible with every swipe. "What's the matter?" One officer snickered. "Thought you were too good for a little trim. Bet she won't be strutting around like she's royalty now," another added, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. Aisha's breath came in shallow bursts, but she forced herself to focus on her breathing. In and out. Steady. Controlled. These men wanted to break her spirit. They wanted her to cry, to beg, to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shattered. She wouldn't give them that. Not now. Not ever. When they finally stepped back, the tall officer brushed his hands off like he had just finished some tiresome chore. "There," he grunted. "Now you look more presentable." They released her roughly, and Aisha remained in the chair, her scalp stinging, the cool air hitting her bare head. The hallway fell quiet except for the faint hum of the clippers winding down. She reached up slowly and touched her scalp, feeling the uneven patches and prickly remnants of what had once been her crown. The officer with the clippers gave her a mocking salute. "Don't say we didn't give you a makeover." Another wave of laughter rolled through the hallway, and Aisha took a deep breath, gathering her scattered pride. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. It would be so easy to unleash her fury, to lash out, to tell them exactly who she was and watch their smug faces collapse in horror. But no, not yet. She wanted them to feel safe in their arrogance, to believe they had truly stripped her of her power. An older, more senior officer approached, his gaze flicking between the clumps of hair and Aisha's bare scalp. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, glancing suspiciously at the men. "Just handling the situation, sir," the tall officer replied smoothly. "Found this one wandering around. Had to make sure she wasn't a threat." The senior officer frowned but didn't press further. "Get her out of the way. The judge is about to enter the courtroom." The officer smirked at Aisha one last time before moving down the hall. She rose slowly from the chair, ignoring the dull ache in her neck and the humiliation burning under her skin. As the heavy wooden doors to the courtroom swung open, she smoothed the lapels of her blazer and walked forward, unbothered by the murmurs and shocked glances from those who had witnessed her public degradation. Her steps were steady, graceful even, as she crossed the threshold. The officers froze when they realized she wasn't leaving. Instead, she walked straight to the judge's bench. With practiced precision, she settled into the seat of authority, adjusting the microphone before looking down at the courtroom, and at the very men who had just humiliated her. Stunned silence engulfed the room. The officers' faces drained of color, disbelief plastered on every one of them. The tall officer who had wielded the clippers looked like he'd seen a ghost, his lips trembling as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. Aisha folded her hands calmly on the desk, giving them a look so piercing and powerful that even the gallery seemed to shrink under the weight of her gaze. She cleared her throat, her voice ringing out with unshakable authority. "Before we begin today's proceedings," she said, her tone razor-sharp and commanding, "I would like to address an incident that occurred just outside this courtroom, a violation of personal dignity, professional conduct, and fundamental human rights." The officers stood rooted to the spot, their bravado gone, replaced by fear and regret. Aisha took a breath, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. The real judgment had only just begun, and it wouldn't be one they would ever forget. The stunned silence that gripped the courtroom felt almost tangible, a thick, oppressive weight pressing down on everyone within its walls. Aisha Carter's voice was calm, her words precise, each syllable delivered with the kind of measured authority that made it impossible to look away. The gallery was filled with lawyers, clerks, plaintiffs, defendants, and even reporters, all of whom had filed into the room for what was supposed to be a straightforward hearing. Now their eyes remained locked on the woman sitting at the judge's bench, the woman whose hair had been stripped away by ignorance and cruelty mere moments before, the woman they had allowed to be brutalized without so much as a single word of protest. Aisha met their gazes, one by one, her dark eyes filled with an intensity that made even the most seasoned attorneys shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Justice is not just a word written in law books," Aisha continued, her tone steady, measured, relentless. "It is a principle, a sacred promise meant to be upheld with integrity, fairness, and respect. When that promise is violated, especially within these walls, it is not only the individual who suffers, but the very foundation upon which our legal system stands." She turned her attention to the officers who had assaulted her. Their faces were pale, their bodies rigid as if they feared even the slightest movement would condemn them further. Officer Reynolds, Officer Carter, Officer Jennings. She recited their names like accusations, her gaze cutting through their composure. "You made a decision today, a choice to act with prejudice and brutality, to impose your will with force and humiliation instead of respect and professionalism." Officer Reynolds, the one who had held the clippers and taken such twisted pleasure in degrading her, swallowed hard. His hands trembled at his sides, his arrogance disintegrating under the harsh light of exposure. This is some kind of joke, right? He stammered, his voice weak, his bravado nothing more than a shattered facade. You can't be the judge. Oh, but I am. Aisha's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet the power behind her words resonated like thunder. Judge Aisha Carter, appointed by the President of the United States, sworn to uphold the very laws you so brazenly violated today. The murmurings in the gallery grew louder, eyes widening with a mixture of shock, admiration, and, in some cases, guilt. Some of them had watched the incident unfold in the hallway. Some had even smiled, indifferent to the cruelty unfolding before them. None of them had spoken up, and now their silence was an indictment in itself. The court stenographer's fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, unsure whether to record what was unfolding. Aisha's eyes flicked to her, and she gave a curt nod of permission. Every word, Aisha said firmly. Every detail. Let the record show the events that transpired here today. Let it be known that within these walls, no one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge. The gallery remained frozen, its occupants holding their breath as the officers looked at each other, their panic almost palpable. Aisha could see the calculations behind their eyes, the frantic search for an excuse, a defense, anything to shield themselves from the consequences of their actions. Officer Jennings, the youngest of the three, opened his mouth, his words faltering before they even formed. We were just following protocol, making sure she wasn't carrying anything dangerous. Is that so? Aisha's gaze sharpened. And where exactly, in your so-called protocol, does it dictate that you assault and degrade a civilian without cause or justification? Where does it say that you have the right to strip someone of their dignity simply because you don't like the way they look? Jennings's mouth snapped shut, his cheeks flushing with shame. The senior officer who had interrupted the incident in the hallway looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Your actions today were not only reprehensible, Aisha continued, her words precise and unforgiving. They were illegal, and I intend to make sure that those responsible are held accountable. Officer Carter, who had laughed so easily at her suffering, seemed to shrink beneath her gaze. His fingers twitched as if wanting to reach for his radio, to call for backup, to do anything that might salvage what remained of his authority. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice trembling. I didn't know who you were. And that is precisely the problem, Aisha replied, her expression icy. Respect should not be dependent on status or title. It should be afforded to every individual as a basic human right. But you? She pointed a finger at him, her tone as cold and sharp as a blade. You made the choice to disregard that principle. You made the choice to act as judge, jury, and executioner simply because you thought you could. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one dared to speak, as if the very air itself had been charged with an electricity that threatened to strike at any moment. Aisha let her words settle before continuing. We will proceed with the hearing shortly. But first, these men will be removed from this courtroom and placed under arrest for assault, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power. The courtroom doors swung open, and 2 federal marshals entered, their expressions grim and professional. They approached the officers, their handcuffs at the ready. Officer Reynolds took a step back, his eyes wild with panic. Wait, you can't do this. I was just doing my job. Your job is to uphold the law, Aisha said, her voice unwavering. Not to twist it to suit your own biases. Take them away. The marshals moved with swift efficiency, their hands seizing the officers' wrists and locking the cuffs around them. The click of metal against metal was a final, chilling punctuation to the nightmare they had created. As the officers were led away, the gallery watched in stunned silence, some murmuring in disbelief, others nodding in approval. Aisha remained composed, her face an impassive mask, even as her heart raced beneath her chest. The pain from her scalp was still there, a dull, throbbing reminder of what had been stolen from her. But she had her dignity. and she had her voice. But as she glanced at the room full of people who had chosen silence over justice, she knew her battle was far from over. The scars left by this incident would not heal overnight, and the system that allowed such hatred to fester was one that needed to be dismantled from the roots. As she prepared to proceed with the case that had brought her here in the first place, Aisha made herself a solemn vow. She would fight not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they were less than human. And she would not stop until justice was more than just an illusion. As the officers were escorted out of the courtroom, their protests echoing faintly through the hallway, Aisha took a slow, steady breath. The tension in the room remained palpable, and she could feel dozens of eyes fixed on her, scrutinizing every move she made. Yet she remained unwavering, the mask of authority securely in place. She could not afford to falter now. In the back of her mind, memories threatened to resurface, moments from her childhood when people had tried to strip her of her dignity in much the same way. Back then, it had been bullies at school, mocking her natural hair, taunting her for speaking up, belittling her for daring to be ambitious despite where she came from. She had learned at an early age that the world saw her as less than, and it had taken every ounce of her parents' love and encouragement to silence the lies the world tried to plant in her heart. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a strong, reassuring presence. When they try to tear you down, baby girl, you stand taller. You remind them that your worth ain't up for debate. Aisha straightened in her seat, allowing her hands to rest calmly on the polished surface of the bench. The clerk, still visibly shaken by what had transpired, cleared his throat hesitantly. Your Honor, shall we proceed with the case? Yes, Aisha replied firmly, her voice carrying throughout the room. Let's continue. As the first witness took the stand, the gallery remained on edge, whispers still buzzing quietly between spectators. News of what had just happened was already spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. Aisha knew that by the time the hearing was over, every judge, attorney, and security officer in the building would have heard about the incident. She forced herself to focus on the case, a corporate fraud scandal involving a powerful real estate mogul accused of embezzling millions from housing projects meant for low-income families. The irony was not lost on her. Even in her professional capacity, she found herself fighting for those who had been overlooked and discarded by society. The defendant, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Victor Langston, sat at the defense table, his expression a mask of smug confidence. He was accustomed to using his wealth and influence to sway the system in his favor, and he clearly didn't consider Aisha a threat. His attorney, Malcolm Price, rose to his feet, exuding confidence as he approached the bench. Your Honor, he began smoothly, we would like to motion for a dismissal on the grounds that the evidence presented by the prosecution is circumstantial at best. Aisha held up a hand, silencing him instantly. Mr. Price, the motion for dismissal was previously denied, and we are here to hear the witness testimony. Please refrain from reintroducing arguments that have already been ruled upon. Price hesitated, caught off guard by her firm response. Clearly, he had expected to charm or intimidate his way to an early victory. Aisha gave him nothing to lash onto, maintaining a cold, composed expression that left no room for argument. The first witness was a former accountant from Langston's company, a woman named Lydia Farrow. She took the stand nervously, adjusting her glasses and glancing anxiously between the defense attorney and Aisha. Ms. Farrow, Aisha said gently, offering a small, reassuring nod. Please state your full name and occupation for the record. My name is Lydia Farrow, the woman replied, her voice trembling slightly. I was the senior accountant for Langston Enterprises for 8 years. And can you please describe the financial discrepancies you discovered during your employment? Lydia swallowed, her hands shaking as she clutched the edges of the witness stand. I noticed that funds earmarked for community housing projects were being siphoned into offshore accounts that were in no way associated with the project budgets. At first, I thought it was an error, but when I brought it to Mr. Langston's attention, he told me to forget about it and focus on my other duties. Aisha leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Did you feel threatened or coerced into silence, Miss Farrow? Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, and she nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. After I confronted him a second time, I received a letter from the company's legal team, warning me that I could be sued for defamation if I continued to make accusations without evidence. I knew they had the resources to ruin me, so I stayed quiet, until I couldn't anymore. Langston's attorney jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Speculative and emotionally prejudicial. Aisha fixed him with a stern look. Overruled. The witness is recounting her personal experience. Please proceed, Miss Farrow. The woman nodded, wiping her tears. I began collecting documents. Bank statements, wire transfer records, and internal memos. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. When I had enough proof, I turned it over to the authorities. Thank you for your courage, Miss Farrow, Aisha said with a slight nod of respect. No further questions. As the defense attorney approached for cross-examination, his face hardened, and he shot Aisha a glare. Miss Farrow, he began, his voice dripping with condescension, isn't it true that you were recently terminated from your position due to misconduct? Lydia's eyes widened, clearly caught off guard. That's not accurate. I resigned. But before your resignation, were you not under investigation for financial mismanagement? Aisha's tone was ice-cold as she interjected. Mr. Price, be mindful of your line of questioning. Accusing the witness without evidence to support your claim is a serious breach of conduct. The attorney hesitated, glancing at his client before stepping back. Withdrawn, Your Honor. Aisha's gaze lingered on him, reminding him that she would not tolerate games in her courtroom. As the cross-examination continued, she remained vigilant, refusing to let Price manipulate or intimidate the witness. When the day's proceedings finally came to an end, Aisha dismissed the court, maintaining her poise until the room had cleared. Only then did she allow herself a moment to breathe, resting her hands on the bench as the exhaustion set in. A soft knock at the side door startled her, and her bailiff stepped in, his face somber. Your Honor, there's a crowd gathering outside. Reporters and protesters. Aisha straightened, instinctively smoothing her blazer. Protesters. Yes, Mom. Word about the incident with the officers has spread. People are demanding accountability. There are also supporters, folks who want to see justice served. It's quite a scene out there. Aisha closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. Thank you for letting me know. I'll handle it. As she moved toward her chambers, her reflection caught her eye. Her shaved head stark and raw, a symbol of the brutality she had endured. Yet, in that reflection, she also saw resilience, a woman who refused to be silenced or humiliated. She knew that the fight for justice extended beyond the courtroom, and that the world would be watching how she responded. Determined, she took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever awaited her outside. Aisha spent the next hour in her chambers, her phone buzzing nonstop with calls, messages, and news alerts. The incident in the hallway had gone viral. Clips of the officers shaving her head, taken from security cameras and bystanders' cell phones, had already flooded social media. The outrage was fierce and immediate. Civil rights groups, legal advocates, and even public figures were all demanding justice and accountability. The hashtag Justice for Judge Carter was trending across multiple platforms. She sat at her desk, fingers pressed against her temples as she tried to process the whirlwind of chaos. It wasn't just about her. This moment had become something larger, a symbol of the cruelty and oppression too many people faced daily. And now, the world had a front-row seat. But as much as the attention made her uneasy, she knew there was an opportunity here. An opportunity to do something more than just endure. She had been given a platform. Now, it was time to use it. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Her bailiff, a kind-eyed man named Peter, stepped in cautiously. Your Honor, the chief judge is online too. He says it's urgent. Aisha inhaled sharply, steeling herself. "Thank you, Peter." She picked up the receiver and pressed the flashing button. "Judge Carter speaking." "Judge Carter," a deep, gravelly voice replied. "This is Chief Judge Reynolds. I've just been made aware of what happened to you this morning. I want you to know that we are investigating the matter thoroughly. The officers involved have already been placed on administrative leave pending a full inquiry." "Administrative leave," Aisha repeated, her voice tight. "Sir, with all due respect, they assaulted a sitting federal judge on federal property. There needs to be more than just administrative leave." There was a brief pause before the chief judge replied. "I understand your concern, Judge Carter, but we have procedures to follow. The Department of Justice is reviewing the incident, and I assure you that proper measures will be taken." "Proper measures?" Aisha echoed bitterly. "They humiliated me, violated my rights, and if it can happen to me, what about everyone else who walks through those doors and doesn't have the privilege of a title to protect them?" Another long pause. When Chief Judge Reynolds spoke again, his tone was softer, more measured. "You're absolutely right, and I apologize if my words made it sound like I was minimizing the severity of the situation. I've seen the footage. What happened to you was unacceptable. But there's pressure from above, from people who'd rather this be swept under the rug. You know how the system works." Aisha clenched her jaw. She did know. She had spent years navigating the labyrinth of bureaucracy and privilege, where accountability was often a matter of convenience. But this time, it was different. She wasn't going to be silenced. "I'm not looking for apologies, Chief. I'm looking for justice. And if the system can't provide it, then I'll find another way." "I understand," Reynolds said cautiously. "Just be careful, Judge Carter. You're walking a dangerous line. You have my support, but not everyone will feel the same." "Thank you for your concern," Aisha replied curtly before ending the call. She stared at her phone for a moment, her thoughts churning. The words of her parents echoed in her mind once more, urging her to stand tall even when the world tried to break her. Her father had taught her the strength of resilience, the power of refusing to bow to injustice. Her mother had shown her the importance of grace and dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. Aisha reached for her phone again, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a smooth voice answered. "Aisha, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Everything okay?" "Marcus, I need your help," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Something happened today. Something big. And I need you to help me make sure the world hears about it." Marcus Hayes was a prominent civil rights attorney known for his fierce advocacy and high-profile cases. They had gone to law school together and remained close friends, even when their careers had taken them in different directions. "I saw the footage, Aisha," Marcus said quietly. "I was just about to call you. That was horrifying. I'm so sorry you went through that." "Sorry doesn't change what happened," Aisha replied, her voice sharp with frustration. "But maybe we can use this. Maybe we can make something good come out of it." "I'm listening," Marcus replied, his tone filled with cautious optimism. "I want to file charges against those officers. Assault, battery, official misconduct, everything they deserve. And I want it to be public. No closed-door negotiations, no under-the-table settlements. I want transparency. I want accountability." Marcus let out a low whistle. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. I'm tired of watching people in power abuse their authority, and if they think I'm going to just roll over and accept what happened, they're sorely mistaken." "I've got your back, Aisha," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "We'll get the ball rolling. But you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly. The department's already circling the wagons, and the backlash is going to be fierce." "I don't care," Aisha said, her words burning with conviction. "They tried to take away my dignity, my identity, but they can't touch my strength, and they can't silence me." "All right," Marcus replied. I'll put together a team and start drafting the paperwork. We're going to hit them hard, and we're going to do it by the book. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." As she ended the call, Aisha's gaze drifted to the small photograph on her desk. It was of her parents, standing proudly in front of their modest home in South Memphis. Their faces were weary from years of hard work, but filled with joy and love. Their sacrifices had given her the chance to pursue justice, to make a difference. And now, it was her turn to honor their legacy by standing up for what was right. She had been humiliated, yes, but she was not broken. And as the world continued to react to what had happened, Aisha knew that her fight had only just begun. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, legal consultations, and countless phone calls. Marcus and his team worked around the clock, preparing the legal documents needed to file the lawsuit against the officers and their department. The footage of the incident was already being dissected by experts and advocates alike, analyzed from every angle. And every time Aisha saw her own shaved head reflected back at her in the mirror, the anger that flared within her was both a wound and a weapon. She would not hide from this pain. Instead, she would let it fuel her. The media frenzy surrounding the incident only grew. News outlets from across the country were reaching out for statements, and public opinion was becoming a tidal wave of outrage and support. She'd become a symbol, a reluctant face of a broader movement against injustice. But Aisha was not interested in being anyone's symbol. She wanted accountability. She wanted justice. The morning of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by a throng of reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Judge Carter" and "End Police Abuse" waved above the heads of the chanting crowd. Aisha stepped out of her car, her bald head uncovered and gleaming under the sunlight. It was a statement of defiance and strength, her decision not to hide what they had done to her. She walked toward the entrance with her head held high, Marcus by her side. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. "I was born ready," Aisha replied. As they pushed through the heavy courthouse doors, the echoes of the protesters' voices followed them inside. They made their way to the courtroom where the preliminary hearing would be held. The tension in the air was thick, and Aisha could feel every pair of eyes fixed on her as she entered the room. The officers involved in the assault sat at the defendant's table, their expressions stiff and uncomfortable. Their lawyer, a smug-looking man in an expensive suit, whispered hurried instructions to them. Aisha's gaze swept over their faces, searching for any sign of remorse. But all she saw was arrogance and fear. Good, she thought. Let them feel the weight of what they had done. The judge overseeing the case, Judge Harper, entered the room, and everyone rose to their feet. Aisha couldn't help but notice the flicker of sympathy in Harper's eyes as he glanced her way. "Please be seated," Judge Harper said, his voice steady and commanding. "We are here today to address the matter of Carter versus the Memphis Police Department, specifically regarding the events that transpired on federal property involving Judge Aisha Carter." Marcus rose to his feet, his posture radiating authority. "Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that the defendants engaged in egregious misconduct, violating not only the rights of my client, but also the principles of justice and human decency. This was an assault on a federal judge carried out by those sworn to uphold the law." The defense attorney rose next, his voice slick and confident. "Your Honor, while the events in question are indeed unfortunate, we will show that the officers acted within their training and protocols, given the perceived threat at the time." Perceived threat? Marcus's voice cut through the air, his disbelief palpable. "Are you suggesting that the mere presence of a black woman in your precious courthouse was reason enough to physically assault her?" "That's enough, Mr. Hayes," Judge Harper interjected. "Let's keep this proceeding professional." "My apologies, Your Honor," Marcus replied, though his eyes remained locked on the defense attorney. "But the facts are clear. The officers acted with blatant disregard for my client's dignity and rights. This cannot and will not be brushed under the rug." The defense attorney's smirk faltered slightly, his gaze dropping to the stack of papers in front of him. Aisha watched, her chest tightening with both nerves and determination. She would not be silenced. As the hearing progressed, Marcus presented the footage, breaking down every second of the violation. The courtroom was filled with the sounds of buzzing clippers, mocking laughter, and the cruel taunts of the officers. Aisha watched as the attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes avoiding her own. Judge Harper's expression grew darker with each passing moment, his gaze flicking from the screen to the defendant's table and back. When the footage ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. Aisha could feel her heartbeat thundering in her ears, but she kept her composure. She had endured the worst of it already. This was just the beginning of her stand for justice. "Does the defense have anything to say?" Judge Harper asked, his voice colder than before. The defense attorney cleared his throat, his confidence clearly shaken. "Your Honor, we request a continuance to properly prepare a response to the plaintiff's evidence." "Granted," Judge Harper replied, his gaze still burning with disapproval. "But let me be perfectly clear. What I've just witnessed is a disgrace to our justice system. And if you don't have a damn good explanation for why this happened, there will be consequences." Aisha's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was progress. And that was more than she'd expected when this nightmare began. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did great today. We rattled them." "They should be rattled," Aisha said, her voice raw. "They should be terrified. Because I'm not stopping until justice is served." "Then we keep pushing," Marcus replied, "every step of the way." Aisha glanced back at the defendant's table, where the officers were hurriedly gathering their things, avoiding her gaze as if looking at her was enough to burn them. They had tried to break her, to humiliate her, to reduce her to something lesser. But all they had done was awaken a fire within her, one that would not be extinguished. And as she walked out of the courtroom, head held high, Aisha knew there was no turning back. The day of the official trial arrived with a sense of gravity that was almost suffocating. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing and microphones extended as they shouted questions Aisha had no intention of answering. Signs of support were held high by protesters demanding accountability, their voices a rhythmic force of determination. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more intense. Journalists were packed into the observation area, their pens and recorders ready to capture every moment. Lawyers from civil rights organizations filled several rows, there to witness a case that had grown beyond Aisha's personal ordeal and become a national reckoning. Aisha took her seat beside Marcus, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. The tension between her and the defendant's table was palpable. The officers avoided her gaze, their faces pale and expressions tight. Their legal team looked equally rattled, the calm arrogance they once displayed reduced to anxious murmurs and shuffling of papers. Judge Harper entered, his face stern and unreadable. His gavel struck like a gunshot. "Court is now in session." Marcus rose to his feet, his voice strong and commanding. "Your Honor, what happened to my client was not only a violation of her rights, but a gross abuse of power. The defendants chose to degrade and humiliate a sitting federal judge because of the color of her skin and their own prejudice. We are here today to ensure that justice is served." The defense attorney rose next, his voice trembling just slightly. "Your Honor, while we do not condone the treatment of Judge Carter, the officers acted out of concern for the security of the courthouse. It was an unfortunate error in judgment, not a deliberate act of malice." "An error in judgment?" Marcus's tone dripped with incredulity. They forcibly shaved her head. They laughed at her humiliation. They did not ask questions. They did not seek to understand who she was or why she was there. Their actions were not just cruel. They were criminal. Judge Harper's gaze fixed on the defense attorney. "I have reviewed the evidence multiple times, and I must say, the justification your clients are attempting to present is weak at best." The defense attorney's confidence continued to crumble. He looked back at the officers, his eyes silently pleading for any semblance of remorse from them. But their expressions were locked in stubborn resentment and desperation. Marcus called his first witness, an expert in law enforcement protocol. The man testified to how the officers' actions were not only unethical but blatantly illegal. It was clear from his testimony that they had grossly overstepped their authority. Then Marcus called several bystanders who had been present during the incident. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of cruelty and systemic prejudice. Each description of Aisha's torment chipped away at the defense's credibility. Aisha's turn came to testify. She stood, her gaze unwavering as she walked to the stand. Her bald head remained uncovered, a symbol of both her resilience and the brutality she had endured. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Marcus said. "Aisha Carter, federal judge for the United States District Court for the Western District of Tennessee." Murmurs rippled through the audience, a reminder of the magnitude of what had transpired. "Judge Carter," Marcus continued, his voice softer now, "could you describe, in your own words, what happened to you on the day of the incident?" Aisha drew in a steadying breath. "I entered the courthouse prepared to preside over a case involving corruption and police misconduct. As I walked through the hallway, I was forcibly detained by two officers. They demanded I sit down. When I asked why, they responded with aggression and disrespect." Her voice grew colder. Without explanation, one officer grabbed a pair of clippers and began shaving my head. It was not a search. It was an assault, a deliberate attempt to humiliate and dehumanize me. And the entire time they laughed. They mocked me. They stripped away my dignity as if I were nothing. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Marcus allowed her words to settle before speaking. "And did they at any point attempt to confirm your identity before proceeding with this violation?" "No, they did not ask who I was. They simply assumed I was a threat because of the way I looked." Marcus nodded. "And when they realized their mistake? When they discovered you were the very judge they were meant to stand before?" "They froze," Aisha replied, her voice trembling only slightly. "They looked at me like I was the monster. But the truth is, they were the ones who betrayed everything their badges stood for." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, but did not dare interrupt. Marcus continued, "Thank you, Judge Carter. No further questions." As Aisha returned to her seat, Marcus's words echoed in her mind. They were powerful, true, but truth alone was not always enough. The defense attorney stumbled through a weak cross-examination, desperately trying to minimize the damage. But it was no use. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no erasing what had been done. Judge Harper looked down at his notes before raising his eyes to the room. "I have heard enough. This matter is not one to be taken lightly. The actions of the defendants are not only a violation of Ms. Carter's rights, but a stain upon the very institution of justice." The silence was thick, the anticipation unbearable. "I am ordering a thorough investigation into the Memphis Police Department's practices and an immediate suspension of the officers involved pending criminal charges." The officers' faces twisted in shock and terror. The power they once held was slipping from their fingers, replaced by the cold realization that their actions had consequences. But for Aisha, it was not about vengeance. It was about justice, about making sure what happened to her would never happen to anyone else. As the courtroom erupted into a flurry of noise and movement, Marcus squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with admiration. "You did it." "No," Aisha corrected softly, her gaze fixed on the officers as they were escorted away. "We did it, and this is only the beginning."